Right, we'll get started. Well, good afternoon and welcome to Ignite, and welcome to our little session that Ed and I are running called Exam 7740, which is all about Windows Server 2016, installation, storage, and compute. My name is Chris Rhodes. I'm an MCT, a Microsoft trainer from the UK, as you can tell from my accent. I'm also a Windows MVP.
My name is Ed Baker. I am also a trainer and MVP, and I also have a different persona called Server Guy at Microsoft.com. So if any of you have any server questions, this is me putting myself on the line. Any of you have any server questions, licensing, deployment, anything, bash an email off and I will either answer it or find the way. Microsoft pay me to do it, by the way. So it's meant for the UK, but I'd like to make the audience large. We've got a lot of IT pros in the room, is that right? A lot of IT pros? Let's prove to Microsoft the IT pros are still valuable and we're still a big audience. Yeah, can I just check before we do go any further? Those of you in the room who have any form of Microsoft certification at all, say yeah and stick your hand up.
Oh, good.
You're all certified. How many of you got certifications in a previous server? Cool.
Wow,
most
people.
I'll hand over to you for this bit, Chris, and we'll...
Okay. Anybody done any 2016 certifications yet? Oh, a few. Okay. All right. So just a quick couple of intros here. What we'd like you to take away from this session is we'd like to help you prepare for your exam. We want you to sit it, preferably this week. Testing is right next door. You can take tests here 50% off while you're here. Now, whether you do it while you're here this week or you do it back at home when you're in more comfortable surroundings and you've had time to breathe and relax after the madness that is Ignite, and you had some more time to study and take on board what we've been telling you, we'd like you to take away a few things. We want you to take away some resources, some links, some information. This deck, we'd like you to take away the recording and watch it back several times over, because this won't all sink in. You won't be able to memorize all of this and remind yourself what you need to do to prepare for your test just in this 75-minute period that we have together. So I recommend you download this afterwards, play it back, pause it, stop and study when you're doing that, so you've got time to do some reading, play with your test labs, go on the web, watch from MVA recordings and so on. But what we're going to do mostly here today is give you the second key takeaway, which is a real deep dive on some of the areas on the exam objective domain. So we're going to walk through that, explain and break it down section by section. We don't have time to cover every single bullet point in minute detail. Our plan is to go 2 inches deep over 80–90% of this, but then to go a mile deep on that remaining 10 to 20%. So we're not trying to cover everything. This is not a 5-day class that we're trying to condense into 1 hour. It's just not going to work. But we're trying to give you some tips, some pointers, and expand into some areas that we think, hey, this is new, or you should learn this. These are some tricky areas, and to try and give you the benefit of our understanding and our experience as test takers as well. So a quick couple of things on general certification. Did anybody here do the Cert 101 session yesterday? Okay, a few of you. If you did not, and you're new to certification, which I think most of you said you were not, I recommend watching that back, because we're not going to spend too much time here on exam technique and what kind of questions might you expect. Please look at the Cert 101 session for that. But what we will spend a little bit of time on is just very quickly talking about the exams in general. And this is a certification that for some of you, if you've not taken any recent exams, perhaps I think there's a lot of hands went up saying that they had taken maybe 2012 or 2008 server exams, for example. Things have changed a little. Cloud is in more focus now. Cloud means change is quicker, right? So things adapt quicker. Azure means change. So these exams may need to be reviewed. If you're looking at this, watching this back online 2 years from when I recorded it today, you may actually want to go back and check that exam blueprint, because it may have changed since we've recorded it today. Please check that. Look on the web, see what's different in both the products, which isn't going to be a huge amount, but what's changed in the cloud and therefore reflected in the exam as well. So keep on your toes. This is part of the suite of technologies that start to get into cloud just a little bit. Not a huge amount for server. Certainly that's more the case for Azure. Quick thing on the exam, you can expect somewhere between 40 and 60 questions on your test. It'll vary. You'll get 2 hours to complete that with a 30-minute time at the beginning, or 15 minutes beginning and end for checking in and review. So it's kind of it's approximately 2 minutes a question, roughly, give or take. You'll be able to review the questions. There may be some that you can't. If you're doing a case study, for example, you'll be able to review that as a block and then move on. But you can review your questions at the end. If you're not sure what to do, you can come back and check them and review them later. you're going to need 700 points to pass. That does not equate to 70%. It could be higher or lower than that. It's standardized. But 700 points is what you're aiming for. So good news. You don't need to get 1,000 points. Okay? It's okay to not get 1,000. All right? You just need to pass. There are going to be some things you're going to see coming up that you'll think, uh-oh, I've never done that before. That's out of my wheelhouse. I don't understand that technology. I could spend 12 hours researching that, but you know what? It's only 5% of the exam. I could be strategic here and play on my strengths, which have higher weighted areas. So look out for those weightings as we examine this as we go through. Most of you here probably have this goal in mind. Would that be correct? Hands up who's trying to attain an MCSA in Windows Server 2016. Great, good to see that. So that means for most of you here, this may well be the first of 3, assuming you're doing it in number order here, first of 3 exams that you'll need to take to obtain that certification. Some people may have done 742 first, and that's fine. It doesn't matter what order you take them in, as long as you've done all 3. For many people, their journey starts right here. I'm expecting that to be the case for probably 90% of people in the room. 740 is usually, well, just going on the sequential numbering here, that's probably where you're going to start, and it's the obvious start point for somebody who's new to this track. When we examine the splits here in the areas on the test, you can see what I mean about the different weightings. So study wisely, these areas are not marked exactly the same. For example, installing Windows servers in host and compute environments is 10 to 15%, whereas implementing high availability, 30 to 35%. So you need to be mindful of that when you're studying, when you're working towards this goal. Okay, proportion your time wisely. So what we're going to do next is walk you through these main areas, section by section, point by point. Like I say, going deep in some areas, speeding up through others, but we'll try and give you some insight into what sort of skills and knowledge you need to be able to ace this exam across each of these 6 areas. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ed, who's going to talk about the first section, installing Windows servers in host and compute environments.
Thanks, Chris. You'll all have your own study methods. Nearly all of you passed an exam or one or more exams, as you've indicated. My personal study method, I open a OneNote, I download the objective domain into that OneNote, and then I put lots of hyperlinks around each individual object in that. If it says install, I go and install it. I read all about installing it, and I put screenshots and that sort of stuff. Works for me. It might not be the way you do things. Bearing that in mind, each of those sections that Chris mentioned, we had 6 sections in the objective domain. Section number 1, which was only 10% to 15% of your exam, has a large number of subsections, from determine what you need to install it, all the way through down to managing server core, managing nano server, installing roles. PowerShell, who loves PowerShell? Not lots of hands, but not enough hands. If you're into Windows and you're into Microsoft and you're into any technology and any administration, guys, you absolutely have to know PowerShell. I would suggest that between 50 and 80% of these questions will have some element of PowerShell. Whether it be right or wrong, it will have PowerShell. It absolutely will. And of course, we're looking at licensing and automatic virtual machine activation as well, which is a bit of a dark art for a lot of people. A lot of these sections will hit areas that you, day to day, do not touch, do not use, and do not think about. Those are the ones you need to deep dive into and really examine hard. Guarantee you, if I was to take this exam tomorrow, I would have to look at this bottom one, and I'd have to go and revise that, on the off chance I might get a question. Because KMS and AVMA, I know certain bits about it, but it's not something I keep in my head every day because I don't do it every day. Let's go into the first section. Windows Server, if you've used it all the way back to NT, Windows Server 2000, 2003, 2008, R2, 12, R2, we had a whole range of masses of editions and types, and each edition and type could have different sections to it and have enterprise and standard and data center. We've brought it right back, right back. We now have Essentials. Essentials is the replacement effectively for Small Business Server. It copes with a small number of users, typically 25. It can be a domain server if you want it to be. We then have the Standard Edition and the Data Center Edition. In 2012, the only difference was the number of virtual machine elements you could run within that operating system. It's all changed. Windows Server Data Center can now do things that Windows Server Standard cannot. It can do software-defined networking, it can do software-defined storage, it can do shielded virtual machines. Be very, very clear in this exam which edition can do what. You will rarely see any workgroup storage servers and any storage server questions in these exams. They might be there, understand the limits of each one that it can do, but you won't need to deep dive into those excessively. It will focus on what can be done in standard and what can be done in data center. The hardware is pretty simple. It hasn't changed a great deal since the days of 2008, 2012. The core software will still run quite easily on standard stuff. However, in the RAM, you've got 512 megabytes. That's for a server installation. There are two types of server. There's server core and server with a desktop experience or desktop experience, isn't it? Yep. 2 gigabytes to run a desktop experience one. 512 megabytes to install a server one. And you need to read the question really, really carefully. You'll read the question and you'll find there's one word somewhere in that question that will divert you off and you go, oh, I got that answer. But no, the second word underneath it is the one it was looking at and it would try and put you in the right direction. So always read the questions really carefully. Think about the differences in those requirements. Big note there about VMs. If you're installing virtual machines, it will fail in 512 meg. You need to give it at least 800, and you also need to run the create page file command. The the docs.microsoft.com, all Microsoft Server docs are now in docs.microsoft.com/Windows Server. That's where you'll find these little command bits of goodness that will tell you the bits you need to do. If you want to use Secure Boot, you will need to have an updated UEFI 2.3.1. If you want to use shielded virtual machines, you will need a TPM 2.0, not 1.1 or 1.2, 2.0. Not many servers are delivered as standard with 2.0, so you won't be thinking in that way. Installation requirements. These have not changed pretty much at all. I'm going to talk about upgrades, but real world, anybody upgrade a server? No, good. Glad I got that.
Move on.
You'll notice, if you can see that graphic, it no longer mentions the word core. The default installation is the core installation. That's no GUI. It's cut right back. That is the default. The desktop experience adds all the extra things you need to update, things you need to manage, things you need to use. Very, very few roles require desktop experience. WDS does. There's a couple of others. Know those roles, because there's a section specifically on installing roles, and it'll ask you a question. Make sure you know the role.
Ed, is there not another way that's not on here as well?
That's the next section.
I know.
Don't steal my thunder.
I'm helping you.
Look.
Oh, NanoServer.
Who loves NanoServer? Anybody use NanoServer? Is anybody else crying like I'm crying that in October the 17th, NanoServer will no longer be available in the normal data center edition? It'll be only for containers. Anybody know that yet? So here we have a difficulty. We have server. The exam isn't going to change for a little while, but in the new RS3 edition, NanoServer won't be there. But the exam will still have it because it's still available in the current edition. Always remember, things do change and you can catch it up. So NanoServer. I'm fairly certain, unless you're a Linux user, any Linux users in the room? Going to use words you might not understand, so like reboot. So when you install stuff like Windows Server, it requires new stuff like updates. And some of those security updates require reboots. 26 on average in 2014 for a desktop experience. 14 for core. NanoServer would have required 2. So that's why they built NanoServer, to cut it right back into a tiny piece. However, you can't just deploy it from the disk. So if you get a question about NanoServer and it's talking about put the disk in, do that, you can't do that. You absolutely can't do that. NanoServer can only be installed in a couple of ways. It's stored in a folder on the distribution media. I was about to say a disk. Nobody uses disks anymore. ISO. You download it, you use ISOs and stuff. And it's stored in a folder, and you import some PowerShell and you run some pretty cool PowerShell. Everybody moaned about that, so Microsoft made a GUI for it. What does the GUI do? It runs the PowerShell in the background. But it's a good thing. It's designed to run, and here's a word or a series of words that I'm going to ask you to explain, born in the cloud applications. It won't run SQL Server with a GUI. It won't run anything with a GUI. It's absolutely tiny. It'll run in about 150 megabytes of RAM, and it'll run on an image that's 600 meg big. Standard server image, 5 gig. So it's designed to do those sort of things, and it's designed to run containers, which Chris will cover a little bit later. It's also designed for nested Hyper-V, which I'll cover a little bit later. So think about Nano Server. It's only 64, for the whole server is only 64-bit, and it will run in a very, very small space. It can run currently as a VM or as a physical device, as a bare metal device. You can install Nano. In the future, you won't be able to do that, so I'm very sad. A lot of roles are available on Nano. You can do DNS, you can do file servers, you can do clustering, you can do a Hyper-V host. You can't do things like Active Directory. Know the roles you can and can't do on Nano. Be clear on those. These are the sections in Nano Server it's going to ask you questions about. And if anybody's never seen it, that's what you get to see when you've installed a Nano Server. It is not designed to be used at all from this interface. It's designed to be used either with remote server admin tools from a client or a server, or it's designed to be used with PowerShell automation and PowerShell remoting. Tiny, I've done all this, tiny, done that, done that, done that. Those are the main roles it will use until October. There's the folder you'll see. It'll be stored as a WIM. The WIM is the whole Nano Server Windows image file, WIM, 142 megabytes big. That's the whole operating system. However, it's useless, completely useless until you add the roles you want in it. So you tell it when you install it, I want failover cluster, I want Hyper-V host. And then you add those packages. Here's an example of the package files. You can use, we all have DISM, don't we? Deployment Imaging Servicing Module, DISM. It's still available, they're never going to kill it. DISM exists. You can use the DISM commandlets in PowerShell, or you can use DISM on its own to deploy the packages into a VHD if you want to. Each of those roles has its own package. You can also, in the modern world of updating from online repositories, where's our Mr. Security? He won't like that very much. You can use package providers. You can use online repositories of packages, and you can pull those packages down using those commandlets. So don't think you can only do it from the media that comes. You can do it online as well. All very simple. Who can't love PowerShell? Find, save, install. Really simple stuff. Really simple stuff. You can also take the Windows image file and convert it to a VHD and deploy the VHD manually if you want to. So first of all, you copy the whole of the Nano Server folder to a read-writable folder on a standard disk. And then you use convert Windows image. And actually, the PowerShell creation tools actually call this PowerShell commandlet anyway. This is in the background. You give it a source path, you give it where the VHD is going to be, you tell it what format, whether it's going to be VHD or VHDX for a Generation 2 virtual machine. You tell it what edition of the operating system you want out of that WIM file, because the WIM file, remember, has multiple editions in if you have multiple editions. And you whack it in and you then get a VHD you can boot as a virtual machine, or indeed boot a standard machine from it. You can also do some really clever stuff using XML. And you can add IP addresses and usernames and passwords, and you can join it to a domain as well, if you want to. I would, though, expect Nano Server questions like this to be phased out over the next 6 to 9 months. As the new server comes in, they're less likely. The exams are updated regularly, and I imagine they will phase out the current Nano Server questions. So if you've studied hard already, now's the perfect time to have a crack at it. Nano Server can be managed in any way remotely that any server can be managed. You can use all the web tools, all of the remote server admin tools. You can use PowerShell remoting. You can use standard Hyper-V commands to manage it. You can build your own stuff to manage it. You can use PowerShell DSC and DISM commands to manage it. And you can use all this really clever development stuff at the end using partner frameworks with lots of acronyms I don't actually know very well, like Ruby and PHP and Python and stuff like that. Now, the second time Ed's going to cry today, last year at this conference, Jeffrey Snover introduced server management tools, which is managing any server anywhere in the world from an Azure browser. That's dead, that's gone. It was only ever in preview. There is a brand new one called Project Honolulu, which isn't in the exam because it's not been updated yet. It may well be, it's a separate product, and that is an on-premises web browser version for managing your servers. There may be the odd question left in about server management tools, so you need to understand, read about it. The documentation is still there in docs.microsoft.com, but you won't be able to use it as a preview because it has gone.
It's tough, this, isn't it? Things change quickly. We said this at the
And
top.
this isn't even cloud. Wait till you get to the Azure ones, which change daily. So I'm not even going to go into server management tools because if you get the question, you're unlucky because you can't even prep for it, really. But trust me, to use a web browser to do live PowerShell into a server was just brilliant. They've replaced it. There's now PowerShell in Azure, but we're not doing Azure today. Then we're looking at images. What images can you use? What can you use to deploy? So we need to look at server virtualization. We step to step. No, we haven't. Sorry, it's in that one looked in the wrong place. Look at Linux. You can put Linux in your VMs if you want to. How do we update our images? What do we use to add hotfixes to online and offline images? How do we service them? Do we use DISM? Do we bring them online and do other stuff? What do we do? Know how you can do all of it. I can guarantee you the questions are not designed to trip you up. They're just designed to work out whether you understand what you're being asked. That doesn't say they're all easy, but they are designed to understand what you're being asked. This is 2 feet 2 inches. Well, I'm not going into that in detail. So plan your VHDs, plan your virtualization, and plan everything very well. Anybody use the MAP toolkit? Assessment and Planning Toolkit. Download it, play with it, use it, look at it. If it's important enough to be in the OD, it's important enough to actually download the tool, install it, and look at it. It allows you to discover everything in your network, to work out what you're going to do with it, tell you whether the hardware and software in your inventory will work with these solutions. It's been updated to Windows Server 2016 now. And it allows you to work out what virtual servers what servers you will need to put your VMs on, and whether or not your current physical infrastructure can be managed in that way. Linux. We love Linux. Not much more to say than that, really, is it? We love Linux.
Not really.
No, it's Linux.
Linux,
Linux will run in VMs. I'll talk about a bit more deep when we go into Hyper-V.
Yeah, it's just to call out the fact that you can have Linux VMs these days. Some will already have onboard support for Hyper-V, so you do nothing. Some you'll need to get extra integration services, depending on the Linux distro.
That's that one. Now, chance for you to have a crack now. A practice question. You plan to install a server that runs NanoServer. You need to ensure that the server can run virtual machines. Which PowerShell command might you run? Are you going to run install NanoServer package and use the DCB package, the host package, the guest package, or the compute package?
All together, if you will. A, B, C, D. B, I think they said.
Did they say B?
They said. It sounded like B. Are they right?
Okay.
Put them out of the misery.
Do you see that? Compute is your host. Compute is your NanoServer Hyper-V host. Say again?
Did marketing decide that?
Marketing decide everything.
No, do marketing know what PowerShell is? So, each of these sections has got a quick top tips area. The one thing I have to say is that this deck, which you won't see today, is about 130.
Oh, there's more slides.
About 130 slides. We're not giving you them all in the presentation. You will get them when you download them. They're just hidden because there is so much stuff we wanted to talk to you about that you would have just sat there and gone, PowerPoint, death. We don't want that. But it's useful. There's some links in there and you can download it and use it. So tip number one, there are lots and lots and lots of examples where you might need to understand NanoServer and all its opportunities, which is frustrating because you're losing that facility. Map Toolkit, they like Map Toolkit. Understand the setup.exe. Understand the switches that go with it. Understand how you can do other things. How would you run a setup.exe? How would you use an unattend switch, an unattend that's stored somewhere else? That sort of stuff. Just check it and practice it. I'll give this one back to you, shall I?
Thank you. Okay.
Storage.
So the second section we're going to address this afternoon is storage solutions. And you might think, yeah, storage sounds a bit boring, it's just disks and stuff. But actually there's been some pretty exciting developments in storage in Windows Server 2016. And actually they fall right here into this first exam. So although that might seem a little bit daunting, some of this tech would normally be pushed off into the later exam, some kind of advanced exam. Nope, it's right here in the very first one people are going to come across. So some of the things we'll talk about here are relatively easy, and you might have done them before if you're an old-timer like me, but we'll run through them anyway. But we're also going to talk about some of the new tech as well. So some of the parts I'm referring to that are relatively easy involve things like configuring disks. While some of that hasn't changed too much, it's essential you know how to do it and the different ways to accomplish it. Ed's already mentioned the importance of scripting and PowerShell and command line. Anybody can click buttons in a GUI with a mouse, and that's not really what we do in data centers. We like to automate, we like to standardize. You're more likely to run a command line, whether it's diskpart or a PowerShell command. Those are the things you need to focus on. So you may have created a partition on a Windows disk before, who hasn't, but learn how to do that the server way with scripting and so forth. So when it comes to configuring disks and volumes, look at that. Look into more detail, especially when it comes to things like the differences between NTFS and REFS. I won't embarrass you by putting you on the spot and asking you that now, but ask yourself, do I know the difference? Are there any differences? Tiny ones? Find out what they are. There are some crucial decision-making questions which might lead you one way or the other. Okay? You've got to find out what those little factoids are. Some of the easier parts, which you should be able to master quite quickly if it is new to you, is knowing the difference between MBR and GPT. One very quick way of understanding that is how big is the disk you're trying to set up here. If it's larger than 2 terabytes, you have no choice. You have to have GPT partition tables anyway. MBR would be game for anything smaller than that, and GPT is also valid for smaller ones too. When you provision a new disk, it'll ask you how you want to play that. Know the different file systems. FAT has been around for a long, long time. No file permissions there, of course. NTFS, you've probably come across file permissions, compression, lots of other attributes in EFS, encryption. With REFS, it's a slightly different gambit, but it's mostly similar to NTFS. So you can use file permissions and folder permissions, but you can't do certain things like NTFS compression. What you do gain is better reliability. That's what the R stands for. So find out what's involved here. Why would I go for NTFS? Most people's default choice, I expect, if you were formatting a disk these days, would be NTFS, right? That would be my default. So when would I go for REFS? Find out. Don't tell me now. Find out. That's what you need to learn. Okay? Know about virtual hard disks. We don't just use them in Hyper-V. You can attach virtual hard disks and create virtual hard disks inside of the disk tools as well, whether or not you use them ultimately in conjunction with a Hyper-V virtual machine. Maybe you use a VHD as a way of making some files very portable and copying it to another server, having that server mount that as a drive and open up those files. That's perfectly valid. But some of you here would probably only think that VHDs are used in conjunction with VMs. Also know, as Ed mentioned, the difference between VHD and VHDX files. This is not new. This has been around since 2012. If you knew that, great, good for you, easy mark. But if you don't, if you haven't come across VHDX and what's new about that, what's groovy about that, find out. I've summarized it here. So sizes larger than 2 terabytes, you can only do with a VHDX file at this time. There are lots of ways to play around with the disks. It could be the command line. It could be server management. Server manager. That's where, if you're a GUI person, that's where you'll probably go to set up disks. And there's a lot you can do in there, such as storage spaces and setting up volumes in there as well. So it's entirely up to you, but please learn all the variant ways of doing tasks. Sometimes the GUI is good, but let's not rely on that. Know how to do it in the PowerShell or the command line tool also. It is a tall ask. I've said here that there are 150 plus PowerShell commandlets. Are you saying we've got to memorize them all? No, not all of them. But look at where you're doing a task. How would I make yourself find out? If I'm setting up a storage space, what would be the commandlet for that? If I'm doing it in the GUI, force yourself to go and find out what the equivalent PowerShell commandlet would be for that task. So things get a little bit more complex as we step up from basic things like formatting disks to creating more complex storage on a server. With server storage, there's a whole ton of things you can do. Who's created a storage pool before? Hands up. About 30, 40%, that's good. All right, these have evolved slightly. If you've never done them before, the storage pool is essentially a big bucket of disks that you can throw in of different sizes, capacities, types. You can throw them together in a pool. You can then combine them and make more useful things out of them. So you can create some RAID volumes, for example. You can add redundancy in there. But you can combine them. So this is a great way of being able to take, let's say, a few smaller disks, bolt them together, and present that as larger storage to an application running on your server. You can also thin provision. So you can present storage to a server or an application that's way bigger than the actual underlying storage itself. And we do that through thin provisioning. All right, so play around with that. If you've never done that before, you can do that on any virtual machine. You can play around, add some sample VHDs to it, bring those into a pool, play with that if you've never done it before. See me afterwards if you don't know how. Okay. Once you do your pools, you get to then play around with virtual disks. Not virtual hard disks, virtual disks. Yeah, sorry, that's confusing. A pool contains one or more virtual disks that you establish with various different RAID options as you see here. You can also have hot spares as well. One thing that will catch some of you out is knowing the numbers. What's the minimum required quantity of disks to do X, Y, or Z? So I've spelled them out for you here. If you're doing a simple volume, there's no resilience there. Just one disk is enough to make that up on the physical layer. If you're doing a two-way mirror, aka a RAID 1, you just need 2 physical disks underneath to make that happen. However, a three-way mirror is not 3 disks, it's 5 disks. There's extra resilience in there because we're protecting against 2 simultaneous physical drive failures with that arrangement. Similarly for parity, you'll need at least 3, but if you want to have protection against 2 simultaneous drive failures with a parity volume, you're going to need to have 7 disks minimum. Okay? Easy numbers to remember, but those numbers don't necessarily sit logically. Also know about how to connect to storage on the network or even present storage to the network. Windows Server has iSCSI Initiator built in to connect to other storage on an iSCSI array on the network or to present that through an iSCSI target. Configure both. Have 2 servers in a test environment, one with the iSCSI target presenting some storage, one with the iSCSI Initiator to connect to that storage. Disks will then show up as local disks as far as the other server is concerned. The Initiator is built in. You just need to configure that and away it goes. Point to a target using an IP address, a name, usually with some security on there. Storage replica. If you haven't had a go at this, this is brilliant. This is a way for you to replicate any old storage across to another server, either in the same data center or between data centers. It could even be in Azure. Run this in Azure. This is very useful for cluster solutions or where you've got an application where the application needs to have a copy of the information in a highly available way in 2 different places. You're trying to protect against, for example, server failure, disk failure. You can use this as a very generic technology that's application agnostic. It's very simple. You might have paid for hardware solutions that do this in the past. All right, now you can do that through software. Find out how this works. It's well worth setting this up and demoing it. All you need to do for this is 2 machines minimum, a volume on each, and you can create this by adding some services. It's pretty straightforward.
Data center only.
Good call. Data center only. Good call. Yeah, you did mention some things are standard only, some things are data center. This is a data center only feature. Good point. Data dedupe is one of my favorite features. We can turn this on to deduplicate blocks within files on a volume. So if you're storing, let's say, a whole ton of ISO files, virtual hard disks, or any files, could just be a regular file server volume, we can deduplicate those blocks and save space. Find out how to do it. What are the command lines? It's relatively easy to set up, but you must have played with it. Practice question. So let's say we're going to create a storage pool on a Windows Server 2016 machine that will provide storage for an application called App1. You need to ensure that App1 can still function if the server suffers 2 disk failures. Let's see who was paying attention. What should I create? Yes, sir. B, I heard C.
I heard C and B and...
I'm not sure. We've heard all sorts here. We need to provide for 2 disk failures. So is a simple storage layout going to help me with 7 drives? Nope, no resilience.
Because you've not pulled it, Chris. It's not storage space.
Good point. A mirror with 5 disks? Could be. Let's have a look. It is the correct answer, B. So again,
C would need 7. Parity would
C
need
would
7.
require 7. Parity would need 7. Correct. All right. So learn the numbers. Okay. Let's hand over to Ed for section 3.
Hyper-V, virtualization. We all love virtualization. It's de facto standard now. 5 years ago, it was like, will we move into virtualization? Not now. Other people provide virtualization, and virtualization over the years has become a numbers game. And I guarantee you now, look at the numbers that Hyper-V will now support in terms of RAM per VM, RAM per host, virtual processors per VM. Just understand those numbers, and nobody will ever need a VM that big, but just know you know those numbers, because sometimes you get what I call a less than optimal question occasionally, where it's just based on numbers that you just need to remember. There are fewer and fewer of those in exams, but occasionally you do get them. So Hyper-V is broken down into a number of sections here. Install your management tools, install Hyper-V, delegate virtual machine management, and then we talk about PowerShell and PowerShell Direct. Lots of things have leapt in functionality since Server 2012. We now have things like PowerShell Direct. So there are a lot of PowerShell commandlets that now have the VM name parameter in that allow me to connect direct to a VM without any networking. That's new, it's exciting, expect question. The new stuff is going to get asked questions on. So learn about PowerShell Direct and how you manage that and how you use it. Here are some numbers. To be able to use virtualization in Windows Server 2016, it is different to Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. There is an additional feature required, SLAT, which was always required on Windows 10 and Windows 8.1, but is now required on the server. SLAT is second level address translation. It's a memory thing. You either have it or you don't. It's not something you can switch on. Your machine either supports it or it doesn't. Just be aware that you may get a question about, you want to do Hyper-V using this table of machines, which machines are relevant. If SLAT isn't in there, you can't use it. You need, as you do and always have needed, the VT or AMD V virtualization chipsets, and you need the DEP, data execution prevention, to stop the VMs executing code and pretending to be somebody else on your motherboard. That is a motherboard. All of those in black are motherboard switchable on and off requirements. You also need not just enough RAM to run the host. You need RAM to run as many workloads as you're going to run in virtual machines.
It's probably also worth calling out the TPM that you mentioned before. If you intend to run shielded VMs, this is where an administrator is not allowed, a host administrator is not allowed to hop on to a guest machine. That's something you can optionally turn on, but that requires TPM hardware on the host. So, otherwise, it's optional.
So Host Guardian Service might appear in this exam because it's a role you can install. Shielded VMs are required for, Data Center Edition is required for shielded VMs, but the roles and functions around shielded VMs and Host Guardian Service are not in this exam. They're in a more 4.2.
Yeah.
4.1, one or the other. I can't remember which one it is exactly. But you may get questions mentioning shielded VMs because you're talking about a TPM, and you may get questions mentioning Guardian Service because that is a role. So just be aware to know all of those things. And we've got a much wider range of guest OS support, and the guest services integration tools are now available through Update as well. The tools to run this: PowerShell, Ray, Hyper-V Manager, and RSAT tools. So you can run RSAT on Windows 10. The benefit of the RSAT tools at this level now is they are now, you used to have Windows 8 had to be the right RSAT with the right server. Now Windows Server 16 RSAT tools will manage downscale on servers as well. That's new. PowerShell Direct I've mentioned, absolutely awesome tool. You might get a question, I don't know if there are any, but you might get a question. You've got a VM, the networking's broken, you can't get in it. What do you do? Dead easy. You just run enter ps session/VM name because you can get in through PowerShell Direct unless it's shielded. Nested virtualization, hooray. There's another virtualization platform that exists that has for years and years and years and years crowed about this particular feature. This feature is accidental for us. It's here because of containers and nested Hyper-V and Nano server containers. That's why we've got this. Use it. You can now run in your own environments. You can build a server. You can add another server inside that as a VM, enable nested virtualization, and put VMs on the internal server that is already a VM and play to your heart's content. So you can now build whole lab infrastructures to test yourself and study. It has to have certain requirements. If you're going to do it on Windows 10, it must be the anniversary update. I imagine all of you have got anniversary update by now because the Creators Edition is out and the next one's out in 2 weeks' time, so I imagine you'll be within 2 editions. If you're going to use nested virtualization, the VM you're going to put the nesting in must be generation 8, a generation 2 VM and at version 8, which is equivalent to the same thing, and it must be an Intel processor with those requirements. You also must do a couple of other things, which I'll show you on the next slide, but you must tell, with the virtual machine off on the host, you tell the virtual machine that its VM processor extensions are switched on. Then you switch the virtual machine on, and hey presto, you can install Hyper-V. A couple of other areas on this. You cannot have dynamic memory on it, and you either need to enable MAC address spoofing on it, or you need to use a NAT switch on the inside, otherwise you cannot use this. So several areas in this slide and the previous slide, nested Hyper-V is brand new. Expect questions. Build it, play with it, use it, test it. It's the best way of learning.
And NAT switches are new as well, aren't they, for Hyper-V in 2016?
Well, it's actually, I'm lying, it's not a NAT switch, it's a new NAT object. It's an object within a switch, to be specific.
But it is new.
It is brand new, yes. In configure virtual machines, there are a whole bunch of settings. Anybody not run a virtual machine in Windows Server? So you know how to do it, but just really laboriously open the GUI, go through the settings and look at every single one. Switch the virtual machine on. Now see what you can change. Switch it off. Now see what you can change. Because some things you can only do at the beginning, some things you can do with it off, and some things you can do with it on. There is the facility to live add and remove memory in a virtual machine now, but not a nested one. So be careful you know what you're doing in virtualization in that way. Absolutely know the differences between a Generation 1 VM and a Generation 2 VM. For Generation 2, you must use a VHDX, required. So if the question has VHD, it cannot be a Generation 2 VM. NUMA spanning, understand that. That's in the settings as well. Look at dynamic memory, look at smart paging, look at all of the options to see what you can do when it's on and when it's off. Always explore. Whew, lots of things available in Generation 2. Secure boot. If you're going to use shielded VMs, you must be secure booting. You can now have TPMs, virtual TPMs in Generation 2. Obviously, the machine you're doing it on must have a TPM, but you can use virtual TPMs. Generation 2 can only use a Windows Server 2012 and greater as the guest. And of course, you can only use, you can't use IDE disks in Gen 2. And Gen 2 has secure boot, UEFI boot up, and you can add network cards. You can add a lot more to a Generation 2 while it's on.
There's a hot add facility,
Yes.
isn't there?
Hyper-V storage. This confuses a lot of people. They've just got through what Chris was talking about, building storage in a real physical machine. How do I manage my Hyper-V storage? How do I manage shared storage? What storage can be used to do what type of movement of my virtual machine without downtime? We're going to go into that in a little bit in the high availability area. Look at production checkpoints. Microsoft spent 10 years telling people, don't use snapshots as backups. Every single person used snapshot as a backup. Now you can use snapshot as a backup, so it's called a checkpoint, and it's called a production checkpoint. Know the differences. It doesn't store the memory. So when you do a production checkpoint and you go back to it, your machine is off because it hasn't stored the machine state. Look at questions about that. Fiber channel, I can say I've never seen anything like that, but the fiber channel adapter is still in there and it's still available for questioning. Look at storage quality of service. That's a pretty good feature, and it's been developed greatly in Server 2016 as well in the software-defined storage. Look at your QoS. and differencing disks. Anybody not know what a differencing disk is? Differencing disk. So it's like parent-child disk. You create a disk, you put an operating system on it, you sysprep it, you seal it, you make it read-only, then you install a new VM, you point your disk at that disk. When you start it up, the deltas and the changes go on the differencing disk. Performance is now quite good, but you wouldn't use it in production. So think about when people are talking about in questions about differencing disks and production, think about whether you would use it or not. If the question doesn't mention lab or test, you're unlikely to want to use a differencing disk. Types of disk, I'm going to whiz through this because you've mentioned most of that. Know the difference between fixed, dynamically expanding and differencing. And I'm going to go back to REFS. Windows Server 2016, if you create a 1 gigabyte disk in REFS, it'll take about a second and a half. Fixed disk. If you create a 1 gigabyte fixed disk in NTFS, it'll take not much longer. Do the same for 100 gigabytes in NTFS and REFS. REFS will create the 100 gigabytes in exactly the same time, 1 second. It makes no difference. It's that much better. Understand the differences between NTFS and REFS. And data dedupe especially. It's huge. It's changed massively. Shared VHDX. If you're going to use shared storage for virtual machines, it must be VHDX. More applicable really to the high availability we'll cover in a little while, but it must be a VHDX to share storage. Hyper-V networking, masses of change here. Remember switching and teaming your switches. We can now do that both in the GUI and in PowerShell, and Windows Server has introduced switch embedded teaming. Switch embedded teaming is for storage-defined networking, so that when you've got a load of machines you want to make changes to, if you make a change to the switch, you don't have to have the credentials to get into the VM. So just be aware that switch embedded teaming is there. There's a PowerShell commandlet. You create a switch, you point it at network cards. Any VM that connects to that switch is de facto teamed. Worth thinking about. It is in this exam, but not as much as in the 741. Teaming is important to understand. How you team, methods of teaming, whether you're doing active, passive, what type of switch dependent, switch independent. There is lots and lots you can configure in teaming when it's really just click and point. Nothing in there really. And that's going to be a very short one. I'm going to move on for that. PXE, only in Gen 1. So if you need to do a Pixie boot, it needs to be Gen 1. Legacy network adapter is only available in Gen 1. Native support is in Gen 2. So you can't boot to a legacy network adapter in a VM Gen 2.
Was there a typo? Go back.
We tried not to get them all where? That's absolutely 10 gigabits. My apologies. There is a typo in that section. Thank you.
Yes, network adapter should read 10 gigabits
Every
per
network
second.
adapter in Hyper-V is a 10 gig connection. Prize, you've got some swag, sir. I'll bring you some swag in a minute. That's your swag, by the way.
I have to donate my
check
service.
them. Okay. Virtual switches. Know the difference between external, internal, and private. Who can communicate with what with an external, an internal, and a private? Sounds really simple, but the questions can be very confusing about you've got this VM and this VM and this VM. You want to do this, but not allow this. Which switch should you connect it to? Or what switch should you create? Understand that as well. I'm going to switch off that quickly. NIC teaming, I've done that. Really simple, new VM switch. I'm going to switch on that one as well, because I'm behind now, aren't I? You're going to shout at me in a minute. Practice question. You plan to deploy a Hyper-V-based nested virtualization solution onto a number of servers. The nested servers need access to the internet. You have the following virtual machines available. You need to identify which servers from the following table can be used for this purpose. Shout. Shout. We're saying D. Okay. So I'll talk you through that one. Server 1, it's a VM7. It's not going to happen, is it? Server 2, It's a standard external network switch. We mentioned it must be NAT or it must be MAC address spoofing. So it's got to be 3 and 4.
Sometimes with those kinds of questions, you've got to make sure you're looking at the right column.
Oh.
Okay, so the fact that it was nano server or standard or whatever, irrelevant. It's the networking that's being called out.
Yeah. There will be distractors in every area of every question, but they do check very carefully that A, they're right. They will never ask you anything that is physically, absolutely, you won't get an answer that can't be done, ever. So know the difference between the switches, know how they work, understand the advanced NIC settings, understand the hardware, things like VMQ and virtual receive side scaling, that sort of stuff, and teaming. Teaming's big. Containers.
Containers, wow, if that wasn't enough to follow, let's do containers. All right, containers is a whole brand new thing for Windows Server 2016. It's something that just came in, and there's a lot of interest for this. It is part of the exam. You're expected to know it. You may never use it, some will, some won't. In reality, a minority of you probably will, but you should have...
Quick test. Who's used containers?
Ooh, like 5%. 5% of people there, roughly.
It's Docker on Windows Server. So.
So yeah, this is one where you want to create a test lab and play with it and try it out. It is a bit confusing. Let's try and explain some of that as we go along. But as you can see, the kinds of things that you're going to be asked about is how do I deploy support for containers on a Windows server? How do I create a container-based server? You're not necessarily going to need to go into the app level. This is more about the infrastructure, the server level stuff, not about the applications sitting inside of those containers. You need to know what kind of things might be in there, but not how to really build those apps. So you're going to look at things like, what's the right platform to choose? Should I be doing Nano? Should I be doing Windows Server containers? Should I be doing Docker? What should I be doing? So we'll try and unpack some of that as we go through here. So first of all, what is a container? This kind of diagram you've probably seen quite a lot before because it represents just a regular old-fashioned server. Hardware at the bottom, operating system in the middle, and then application tier at the top. I've been around in IT for over 20 years. That looks very familiar to me. What's happened in recent times, as Ed mentioned before, is everybody's gone and used server virtualization, Hyper-V, of course. So nowadays, that's probably what you've got running in your data center. A whole ton of virtual machines running on Hyper-V hosts. That's what this picture represents. That's kind of a way of doing server virtualization, but you can see here that each of those computers has its own operating system, it has its own kernel. What we've moved over to now with containers is being able to essentially share the operating system, but to virtualize more, if you will, at the app level. This gives you a greater density. You can have many more containers running in the same space as you would otherwise have virtual machines. So this is all about data center density. It's all about giving you multiple instances of the application for high availability and for load balancing. And it's also a very small object. A container is a relatively small thing. It's quick to deploy, and it's extremely fast to boot up. So when you need more demand for more capacity, you can boot them up sub-second. You don't have to wait the length of time it is to boot a VM traditionally instead. So there's a lot of attraction to this. We're not trying to teach you everything to do with containers, but that's the basics of a container deployment. Now, what's kind of interesting here is that there's two flavors of this in Windows Server. There's what's called a Windows Server container, where you have one shared kernel that all the containers use. Or you can go for a more isolated model where we use Hyper-V. We bring in Hyper-V, we add container technology to that, so each of your containers now is running on its own dedicated kernel, courtesy of Hyper-V extensions. This gives you greater isolation. Each of the containers on the bottom right are completely isolated. If one crashed, it would not affect the others, whereas that could be the case for a Windows Server container. Okay, so you've got to look here at which is the most efficient in terms of isolation or which is the most efficient in terms of performance. You have those two choices. So this is all new. If you can, play with them, install this. It's a role that you can add onto a Windows Server. I would highly recommend you do play with that. The host that you run these containers on could be a full server with a GUI, it could be a server core, or it could be, as Ed mentioned before, a nano server. That nano server is that very small overhead compute box. If you add nano server and containers together, you get a high level of efficiency, a very high level of data center density. So that is extremely attractive to hosters and to people rolling out massive applications. It's new for all of you guys, so play with it. Understand how you install support, especially when we come back to things like Nano. Up top here, that's the procedure if you were adding support to a Nano build, and at the bottom you've got adding support through a regular Windows server, adding the container support. You do need networking. These container apps will need to talk to the internet or to your network. Networking support is required as well. Fairly similar conceptually to what Ed was talking about in the previous topic. Docker is not part of Windows. Who's heard of Docker? Hands up. Everybody's heard of Docker. Okay, we can install Docker support on the Windows Server box. Docker is what most people, it's not the only container solution on the market, but it's the most well-known one. You can install Docker support onto your Windows Server so that we're running the Docker services underneath to run Docker applications. If you're talking to app developers, inevitably you'll have a conversation that involves the word Docker somewhere in there because they'll want to support that. So you can add that on. It does not come with Windows. You'll need to add the container support as we've just said, but then you'll need to add Docker as a download as well. Once you've got that, you can add Docker-based images to your server. There's quite a few steps here. It sounds pretty complex. It is relatively complex, but it's not that difficult to set up in a test lab. And there's examples of this online as well. So my advice would be download Docker, have a play, install the container support, install the Docker support. Have a look at the Docker Hub and the repository for those images too. All right, know how to manage these. Again, it's going to be things like networking and PowerShell type tasks that come up frequently around this. Let's have a quick practice question on this. Your company's developing an application named App 1 that will run Windows Server 2016. App 1 is very resource intensive. You plan to deploy App 1 on a new Windows Server. You must make sure that App 1 does not interfere with kernel resources on the server. How should you deploy App 1? Given that we've just been talking about containers, that should get rid of half the answers. You're saying D? What's the right answer?
D is the right answer.
Okay, cool. Well done. So top tips here from this section. Find out more. That's my call to action. It's all new. Hardly anyone's touched this. Find out more. Download, experiment, play. You can do all that in a VM. Okay? Learn a little about Docker. Don't get too overwhelmed by that. Your exam is not going to ask you Docker questions really, but you do kind of need to know that because that's the native, that's the main, it's not the native big part, that's the main technology that people will use. Find out more.
Okay. This next section is 30% of your exam, potentially. We've mentioned lots about go and do it. I'm going to point you to a really useful resource that's entirely free, TechNet Virtual Labs. Go onto TechNet, search for Virtual Labs, go into Server 16. A lot of what we're talking about, software-defined storage, software-defined networking, containers, Nano, 1 hour long labs, detailed instructions. If you haven't got the experience to build your own infrastructure, you can use those. They're excellent. Top tip. Okay, high availability. This is all about when things go wrong. You want to stop them going wrong, and if they go wrong, you want to make sure that what you're running doesn't go wrong. So it's Hyper-V Replica. This has been around since Server 2012, and indeed a lot of the Azure replica services or replication services have been built on this. It allows you to create a server that's a replica, and the Hyper-V virtual machine is replicated on the remote server, and every change is updated regularly. In 2012 R2, we added step change. You can now replicate to another and replicate on one further. Hasn't changed dramatically in Windows Server 2016. We need to look at live migration. That's moving a virtual machine from one host to another with no downtime at all. Look at shared nothing live migration, which is a fairly scary concept, but is pretty awesome. Look at configuring authentication for these migrations. There are two types you can use, CRED SSP or using constrained delegation in Kerberos. There are some extra steps you have to do in Windows Server 16 for constrained delegation. That won't be in the exam, but if you're going to do it in real life, get on, look at the blog and see what the extra step in the server blog is about that. And then storage migration we're going to cover. Yeah, the container one went on so long. So, we're looking at things like high availability. That just means it's not going to fail. Continuous availability is a little bit higher. Business continuity, disaster recovery. Understand all these terms and what they mean in the question. High availability is not something you can just go, oh, switch that on. We're going to be looking at failover clustering. That's a number of physical nodes. We're going to be looking at replica and movement of those virtual machines for disaster recovery. Storage space is direct. You need to understand it, but not implement it in this exam. You need to understand what it does, how it does it. And then network load balancing. If you've got lots and lots and lots of instances you're using, you don't want one instance to do all the work. You want to manage the load across those instances. All of those environments, all of those areas are in other exams, but you need to understand the technologies and understand how you would install them, not necessarily configure them in detail. There are 3 different options in Hyper-V. You can do host clustering. That's actually turn the physical hosts into a cluster. You can do guest clustering, which means the VMs are part of a cluster. And then you can have network load balancing. A network load balancer, when you install it, is called a cluster. It's not a failover cluster, but it's part of high availability. I've mentioned what live migration is. Understand the differences between those, because you might get a question about high availability, and all 3 of those options are in there, and you need to know which one applies in that question. Failover clustering, this is black art to a lot of people. People who do this all day, every day, think it's really easy and very, just off the wall, but it's not. It's very, very difficult if you don't do it regularly. There's been lots and lots of changes in Windows Server 2016. In 12, we gave you cluster-aware updating, which means you didn't have to do lots of work to update your cluster. In 16, you now have rolling upgrades, so you no longer have to build a new cluster, move everything on it, destroy the old one. You can now add a 16 node to a 12 cluster, a 12R2 cluster, move some VMs across, add another one, run what sort of command? PowerShell, thank you. Run a PowerShell command, simple command, which is something like upgrade or update cluster functional level, bang, and it becomes a 16 cluster. Know that, that's new. Understand cluster shared volumes. That's a piece of shared disk, normally using the resilient file system, that will share disks across a storage pool so that each VM or each host can see that as its own storage. Understand those in detail. Masses of areas in this. I've explained nearly all of that. I'm going to flick through this slide because you won't read it now, and I'm not going to read it now, but it's got a lot of detail about the terminology used in clustering, what a node is, what a service is, what quorum means. There's a new type of quorum available. You can use cloud file storage, cloud file share up in Azure if you want to. And this is the new stuff, software-defined data center. Understand how this works, why you would use it, when you would use it, because there are several types. We've got storage spaces direct, or we've got the traditional stuff, which is traditional SAN, with all of these features. We've got software-defined storage with all of those features, which would take about 4 hours to describe all of those. What type of storage can you use? All of those. Understand the differences, understand how you would use them. The physical steps. Quite a lot of questions are build list questions. You want to do A, B, C. What order do you do these steps? Here's 8 steps. Which order do you do the 5? You're not going to use them all, you want 5 of them. Some of them are very similar. Understand which bits you have to do. Verifying a configuration is very, very important. If you don't verify it, it won't be supported. You can create a cluster by default and it will steal all the storage from the nodes because there's a little checkbox at the bottom when you create it saying no storage. If you haven't checked that or unchecked it, it will steal all the storage and you won't be able to create separate storage disks from it. Niche little things like that. Manage it through Failover Cluster Manager. You can't do everything in the GUI. Some things you can only do in PowerShell. Storage Replica. We've done this. Storage Replica is immense. It's only available in Data Center. Up to a 50-kilometer synchronous fiber replication of data, just like that. You need 2 data centers, one at each end, so it's not a cheap solution. And here's the new architecture. This is the big new software-defined storage. We have 2 options, a converged or disaggregated. That means you have a compute cluster with your virtual machines on, and you have a storage cluster with storage spaces direct running a scale-out file server. That means that you can contract or expand each of those separately. It's a lot more licensing. So if a question said at minimum cost, you wouldn't use this because you've got that many data center licenses. And then we have storage spaces direct with hyperconverged. Hyperconverged means you have one cluster, one set of hosts, the storage network and the compute network is all built in together. You can expand it, scale it up and down together. You won't be asked detailed questions on how you build and what you do. You just need to understand it, what it is, when you would use each type. And then the usual management and monitoring. And if anybody's like me, management and monitoring is the worst section. It's quite small, but it's the detailed little bits about whether you'd create one of these and whether you create one and how you do it. And I regularly, when you get your test result, you get these long bars. Managing and monitoring on mine is always a real low one because I find I don't spend enough time learning about those managing and monitoring. Lots of new changes in failover clustering. We have a notion now of node quarantine. If a node fails 3 times in a set time, first time it will be paused. The second time it will be paused. The third time it will be drained and quarantined, which means that you will never have this node up, node down, node up, node down, virtual machines flying all over the place. It will quarantine that node until you have to go in and say, right, what was the error? I'm going to fix it, and then you can just rejoin it to the cluster. That used to be a manual process. Then we move into migrations. Understand what a live migration is, what the requirements are to be able to do it, what the difference is with live and quick and storage. Understand that import and export isn't highly available. It's just importing and exporting live and dead machines. You don't have to do that with it switched off. New feature called network health protection. That's worth looking at as well. And also drain on shutdown. That's a useful slide. That should answer 50% of your migration questions. Network load balancing. Build one, forget it. There's not an enormous number of network load balancing questions in Server 16. In the software-defined networking one, absolutely, because there's a whole new service, network controller, that builds a whole new set of load balancers built on Azure load balancing, and they're focusing on that a great deal more. But you need to understand what it is, you need to understand how you install it, and what you do to run it. When you would use that over a failover cluster. Traditionally, load balancer would be in front of web servers, stateful stuff, and the data would be stored on your VMs on your failover cluster. Practice question. You have 2 host servers that run Hyper-V named Server 1 and Server 2. You plan to move a virtual machine named VM1 that runs a line of business application from Server 1 to Server 2. You need to minimize downtime taken to move VM1. Minimize downtime. Now that doesn't say you need to have no downtime, but it's actually meaning that because there is an option in the answer that says no downtime. So that's an interpretation question. It doesn't say none, but there is an answer option that says none. And we're saying that is what? Live migration.
It's not as fast, but it gets it done with no disruption.
You've got 5 minutes for monitoring.
Easy.
That doesn't sound like it's planned, but it absolutely was, because you've got the slides, and as you can see, monitoring is not the most popular topic as we move into it.
Now, we've kept this piece short because most people here would probably have experience in some of this stuff. This section here, honestly, if you've done this kind of stuff before in 2008 and 2012, there's not a lot of new stuff here, but that's not to say you mustn't get it all right. So for those that aren't super aware of things like WSUS and performance monitoring, let's walk through some of those. All right, make sure you're familiar with WSUS, Windows Server Update Services, what it is, how it works, how to configure it. upstream servers, downstream servers, how to get clients to connect to it, and the group policy settings that go with that as well. Many people have done that in production, so it's well documented. Learn how to use the WSUS admin console or possibly PowerShell to manage that. PowerShell commands, again, will come up. Okay. Know how to create groups in WSUS to deploy your patches. Defender updates are new for this as well, so you can put those in for antivirus updates too. Windows Server backup, okay, it's not the most popular one on the market, but it's there, it's tested on. Learn it, use it, at least in a test sense, so you can see how it works. It's actually quite good. We won't get into Azure backup, that's a whole different thing, but know what you can and can't back up with it. Key scenarios, regular servers, Hyper-V hosts, Hyper-V guests, all good. All right, monitoring your servers. You need to know some of the main tools, Performance Monitor, Event Viewer, but also in specific terms, I'm going to call out a couple of things here. We've probably all seen, who's used Performance Monitor before? Quick show of hands? Yeah, thought so, move on. Okay, but look at things like data collector sets, less well-traveled path inside of that tool. So this is where you can record that performance information and look at it later in those graphs. So you can set it up to record and then come back later.
Surely everybody uses that when you build a server for your baseline.
Performance baselines, absolutely. There are a couple of other associated tools. Know which is the right one for the right task in hand. Performance Monitor, Resource Monitor, kind of similar. Do different things, play with both. They're relatively straightforward. Which brings me on to my practice question. You plan to deploy a new website to your web server tomorrow. You plan to monitor the amount of requests to the website during the first hour of it going into production. You need to ensure that you can discuss the results in a meeting at the end of the day. How should you collect the information for the meeting? D, Performance Monitor, to create a user-defined data collector set. Now, you could have said C, possibly System Data Collector Set. We want to specify specific things here. We want to look for IIS, it's a website, so we want to look for IIS counters. So we don't just want a general server performance thing, we want IIS-specific counters. So that's why we said user-defined in this case.
That wouldn't come in the system data.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's what I said. All right, top tips. Understand things like patching, WSUS. It's very important. Know how to set it up in an enterprise as well as a single site environment. Know about the backups, host-based versus guest-based, particularly when it comes to Hyper-V. Know what you can back up, and just get used to those tools. Performance Monitor, Resource Monitor. They're bread and butter tools that you should have seen before, probably, if you've worked in IT for any length of time. But all the same, go through, make sure you're familiar with them all. OK, so thank you very much for your time. Please watch this back. As I said at the start, you'll probably want to watch this back several times and pause it so you can go off and do your research. We thank you very much for your time.
Download it, because there's a lot more slides than you saw. A lot more slides.
Yeah,
we're here for a while. Yes, sir. Can you go to the Mike? We can't hear you unless it's.
Well, let's take those in a second. Let's wrap up here. We do want your feedback. Please do rate the experience in the app, the MyIgnite app, to give us your feedback on that. We're going to be around if you have any questions afterwards, so please hang around. MCT ambassadors are around all week, so if you have any questions about this exam or certification tracks, please see the folks right outside the room at the front desk there. Thank you very much.